Stray Kitten followed the cop. What happened next will shock you. The night shift was supposed to be quiet. That's what Officer Luke Grayson kept telling himself as he walked down Mason Street at 2 a.m., rain pelting his uniform like tiny bullets. 19 hours into what should have been a 12-hour shift, thanks to Officer Rodriguez calling in sick. Again. The streetlights cast sickly yellow pools on the wet pavement, and the only sound was the static buzz of his radio and the rhythmic splash of his boots in puddles. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the rain. A meow. Luke stopped, hand instinctively moving to his holster. 15 years on the force had taught him that even the most innocent sounds could be trouble. He swept his flashlight beam across the alley entrance to his left, illuminating scattered garbage and a rusty dumpster. Another meow, clearer this time. "Show yourself," he muttered, more to himself than whatever was hiding in the shadows. The beam of light caught a pair of gleaming eyes, and then, unexpectedly, a tiny orange kitten emerged from behind a soggy cardboard box, its fur plastered to its body by the rain. Luke's shoulders relaxed, though he didn't move. The kitten took a tentative step forward, then another, its little paws leaving wet prints on the concrete. Despite himself, Luke felt the corner of his mouth twitch. The thing couldn't have been more than a few months old, and it was looking at him with an intensity that seemed almost human. "Go on, get," he said, waving his free hand. "Go home." The kitten tilted its head, then patted closer. "I mean it," Luke warned, but his voice had lost its edge. "I'm not exactly a cat person." The kitten sat down directly in front of his boots and let out another meow, this one somehow managing to sound both pitiful and demanding at the same time. Luke sighed, glancing up and down the empty street. No witnesses to his moment of weakness, at least. "Fine," he growled, crouching down. "But just until the rain stops." As he reached for the kitten, his flashlight beam caught something metallic around its neck. A collar? Strange for a stray to have one, especially one this young. The kitten didn't resist as he gently turned the small metal tag, wiping away the grime with his thumb. His brow furrowed. Instead of a name and phone number, there was only a string of characters. R375BLK27. "What kind of name is that?" he muttered. The kitten just stared at him, water dripping from its whiskers. Something about the code tickled the back of Luke's mind. It looked almost like, but no, that would be ridiculous. Still, as he tucked the kitten inside his jacket, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random stray. The way it had appeared, the strange collar, the way it was now purring against his chest as if it had been looking for him specifically, none of it felt random. Back at his patrol car, Luke settled into the driver's seat and pulled out his phone. The kitten immediately climbed onto his shoulder, leaving wet paw prints on his uniform. He tried to shoo it back onto the passenger seat, but it just dug its tiny claws in deeper. "Stubborn little thing, aren't you?" he muttered, pulling up the department's database app. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He was probably wasting his time, but he typed in the code from the collar, R375BLK27. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his screen flashed, and a case file appeared. Luke's heart skipped a beat as he read the header. Missing persons case #R375BLK27 subject, Lancaster, Sophia status. Cold case presumed deceased last seen, 5 years ago. "That's impossible," Luke whispered. The kitten on his shoulder meowed softly, as if in response. His radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, what's your 20? Luke stared at the case file, then at the kitten, which was now watching his screen with an unnervingly focused expression. He should call this in. Something this strange needed to go up the chain of command. And yet... "Unit 47 copy?" He grabbed the radio. "Unit 47 here. Just finishing up patrol on Mason. All quiet." He paused, then added, "Going to swing by the station before heading in. Need to file some paperwork." "Copy that, Unit 47. Luke put the car in drive, his mind racing. The kitten settled into his lap, its purring a steady vibration against his leg. As he drove through the empty streets, the rain beginning to ease, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet night shift had just become something much more complicated. And somehow, he knew, this was only the beginning. The fluorescent lights of the precinct's basement archives buzzed overhead as Luke pulled another dusty box from the shelves. The kitten, which he'd started calling Echo, in his head, sat perched on a nearby filing cabinet, watching his every move with those unsettling amber eyes. "You know," Luke muttered, rifling through old case files. "Normal cats sleep 20 hours a day. You haven't closed your eyes once." Echo's tail twitched in response. The Lancaster case file was thicker than he'd expected. 5 years of dead ends, false leads, and bureaucratic paper trails, all amounting to nothing. Luke spread the documents across a worn metal desk, creating a timeline of a life that had vanished without trace. Sophia Lancaster, 27 years old. Investigative journalist for the City Herald. Single, lived alone, no children. Last seen leaving her apartment on October 15, 2020. Her editor reported her missing 3 days later when she missed a major deadline, something apparently completely out of character. "Look at this," Luke murmured, holding up a photograph. Echo patted across the desk to examine it. The image showed a younger Sophia at what appeared to be a press award ceremony. She had striking features, sharp cheekbones, determined green eyes, and a slight smile that suggested she knew something others didn't. But it was what she was wearing that made Luke's pulse quicken, a delicate silver necklace with a charm that looked suspiciously like a miniature version of Echo's collar. The cat meowed softly, pawing at the photo. Luke dove deeper into the file. Sophia had been working on an exposé about human trafficking, following leads about missing women from Eastern Europe. Her notes mentioned meetings with confidential informants, stakeouts at warehouses near the port, and something called Project Lighthouse, that appeared multiple times but was never explained. Her last known contact was with an informant named James Kitten. Luke frowned, scanning the report. Kitten had been found finished in his apartment 2 weeks after Sophia's disappearance. But something felt off about the toxicology report. The levels of drugs in his system were astronomical, far more than anyone would willingly take. Luke whispered. This was a message. A soft thud made him jump. Echo had knocked over a stack of papers, exposing a transcript of the last interview with Sophia's sister, Mara Lancaster. Luke picked it up, his eyes catching on a highlighted section. Detective, did your sister mention anyone threatening her? Lancaster. Sophia was always careful. But the week before, she was different. Scared. She said if anything happened to her, I should look for her cat. Detective. Her cat? Lancaster. Yes. Shadow. They were inseparable. When they found her apartment empty, Shadow was gone too. No signs of forced entry. Just gone. Like they'd vanished into thin air. Luke looked at Echo, who stared back unblinkingly. The kitten couldn't be more than 6 months old, far too young to be the same cat from 5 years ago. And yet, his phone buzzed, making him start. An address lookup he'd requested had finally come through. Mara Lancaster still lived in the city, just a few miles from the precinct. He checked his watch, 3:45 a.m. Too early for a house call, but maybe in a few hours. The sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor made Luke freeze. Nobody else should be down here at this hour. Echo's ears flattened against its head, and it darted behind a box just as the archive door swung open. Grayson? What are you doing down here? Captain Harris stood in the doorway, his bulk filling the frame. His eyes swept over the scattered papers, lingering on Sophia's photograph. Sir? Luke straightened, trying to look casual. Just following up on something from patrol. A possible connection to an old case. Harris stepped into the room, and Luke noticed how his fingers kept tapping against his leg, a nervous tell he'd observed over years of poker nights at the captain's house. The Lancaster case? Harris picked up the photo, his expression unreadable. That's ancient history, Grayson. Nothing but dead ends and wasted resources. With all due respect, sir, I found something that might. Drop it. Harris's voice was quiet but held an edge Luke had never heard before. Some cases aren't meant to be solved. Some questions are better left unasked. Understand? Luke met his superior's gaze, noting the slight sheen of sweat on the man's forehead despite the basement's chill. Yes, sir. Good. Now go home. You look like hell. Harris turned to leave, then paused. And Grayson? I mean it. Leave this one alone. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. Luke waited until the footsteps faded, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Echo emerged from hiding, fur bristled. Yeah, Luke muttered. I didn't like that either. He quickly gathered the most important documents, sliding them into his jacket. The rest he returned to their boxes, trying to make it look undisturbed. But as he worked, his mind raced. Why would a 5-year-old cold case make his captain so nervous? What was Harris afraid Luke might find? And then there was Mira Lancaster's statement about her sister's cat. Luke watched as Echo began meticulously cleaning its paws, looking for all the world like a normal kitten. But normal kittens didn't have coated collars that matched police case files. Normal kittens didn't appear out of nowhere on rainy nights, leading cops to long-buried secrets. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to an old friend in the IT department. Need everything you can find on James Chen's death and Project Lighthouse. Off the books. Urgent. The reply came almost immediately. You're playing with fire, Luke. He looked at Echo, who had stopped grooming to stare at him again. Yeah, he murmured. I think I am. But fire, he decided, might be exactly what was needed to bring light to whatever darkness had swallowed Sophia Lancaster 5 years ago. Even if it meant burning his own career to ashes in the process. Dawn broke over the city like a cracked egg, spilling yellow light across rain-slicked streets. Luke sat in his car outside a rundown storage facility, Echo curled in his lap, watching the entrance through bleary eyes. He'd spent the last 3 hours calling in favors, pulling strings, and digging through digital records until he'd found it, a storage unit registered to S. Lancaster, paid for 5 years in advance the week before she disappeared. His phone buzzed. A text from his IT contact. Deleted security footage from Chen's building night of death recovered. Multiple visitors. One badge ID matches high-level department personnel. Luke, what have you stumbled into? He typed back. Working on it. Keep digging. The storage facility's office opened at 7 a.m. By 7:05, Luke was standing in front of Unit 27B, having convinced the sleepy manager that he was conducting an official police investigation. The padlock was rusted, but the key he'd gotten from evidence storage still worked. The door groaned as he pulled it up. Echo darted between his legs into the darkness. Luke swept his flashlight beam across the unit's contents, cardboard boxes, old furniture, a desk covered in dust. Nothing obviously suspicious, until Echo leaped onto the desk and began pawing at a drawer. The drawer was locked, but a few minutes with his pocket knife fixed that. Inside, wrapped in plastic, lay a burner phone, a notebook, and a USB drive. Luke's hands trembled slightly as he opened the notebook. The first page held only 2 words. RB involved. RB, Luke muttered. The same initials from Echo's collar. He flipped through the pages, finding detailed notes about shipping containers, dock schedules, and lists of names, some circled, others crossed out. In the margins were hurried scribbles. RB seen at Dock 7, RB meets with Harris weekly, RB controls everything. The burner phone was dead, but Luke had come prepared with a charger. As it powered on, Echo began pacing the desk anxiously, tail twitching. The phone contained only text messages, all from an unnamed contact. Meeting confirmed. Lighthouse. Midnight. Evidence in place. RB won't see it coming. They know. Get out now. The last message was dated the night Sophia disappeared. Luke was so absorbed in the phone he almost missed the sound of tires on gravel outside. Echo's sudden hiss warned him just in time. He finished his flashlight and crouched behind a stack of boxes, heart pounding. Footsteps approached the unit, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Police! Unit 27B, come out with your hands up! Luke recognized the voice, Detective Martinez from Internal Affairs. But what was IAB doing here? Unless... Officer Grayson, Martinez called. We know you're in there. Captain Harris reported your unauthorized investigation. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Luke's mind raced. Harris had been watching him, probably since the moment he accessed the Lancaster file. But why involve Internal Affairs unless... Echo suddenly jumped onto his shoulder, then sprang to a high shelf near the unit's back wall. The kitten's paw batted at something, a small tear in the unit's corrugated metal wall, revealing a narrow gap leading to the next unit. Last warning, Grayson! Luke grabbed the notebook, phone, and USB drive, stuffing them into his jacket. Echo had already squeezed through the gap. The opening was tight, but adrenaline and desperation made it work. He emerged into the empty adjacent unit just as he heard them entering 27B. Clear! Wait, check that wall! Luke didn't wait. He burst out of the second unit's door and ran, Echo somehow keeping pace beside him. They cut through an alley, scaled a fence, and didn't stop until they reached a crowded coffee shop 3 blocks away. Slumped in a corner booth, trying to look inconspicuous, Luke pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He had one unread message from his IT friend. RB equals Robert Blackwood, Police Commissioner. Luke, he's been commissioner for 15 years. Every major trafficking case in that time has gone cold or disappeared. Every single one. Luke felt the blood drain from his face. The commissioner himself? Then a second message appeared. Harris just issued APB on you. Charges: tampering with evidence, interfering with federal investigation. They're painting you as dirty cop, Luke. Making you look like you're involved in trafficking. What do you need? Echo jumped onto the table, pawing at Luke's jacket where the notebook sat hidden. Luke pulled it out, flipping to the last page. There, in Sophia's hurried handwriting, was an address he recognized, 1879 Ocean View Road. The old Lancaster family beach house. A third message lit up his phone. Multiple units heading your way. Get out. Luke looked at Echo, who stared back with that unnervingly intelligent gaze. She knew, didn't she? Your owner. She knew they'd try to bury it all, so she left a trail. The collar, the storage unit, this address, it was all a backup plan. Echoes rumbled like distant thunder. But why now? After 5 years, why did you find me tonight? The kitten's only response was to head toward the coffee shop's back door. Luke stood, leaving an untouched coffee cooling on the table. He had no badge, no backup, and was now apparently a wanted man. His entire life had unraveled in the space of a few hours, all because of a mysterious cat and a dead woman's final message. But he also had something else, proof that the highest levels of the police department were involved in human trafficking. Proof that Sophia Lancaster had died trying to expose it. And maybe, just maybe, at that beach house, he'd find whatever evidence she'd died protecting. He followed Echo into the morning crowd, just another face in a sea of commuters. But as he walked, Luke realized something that made his skin crawl. He wasn't investigating Sophia Lancaster's disappearance anymore. He was reliving it. The sun had long since set when Luke pulled his borrowed car, courtesy of an old academy friend who didn't ask questions, into the parking lot of the Starlight Motel. The neon sign flickered weakly, missing several letters, making it read, STRIGTMTEL. The kind of place that rented by the hour and didn't bother with security cameras. Perfect for a man running from his own department. Echo had been acting strange for the past hour, pacing the car's back seat and meowing insistently. When Luke finally parked, the kitten scratched at the passenger window with an urgency he'd never seen before. Okay, he muttered, letting Echo out. But we need to be careful. Half the force is probably looking for us by now. The kitten ignored him, darting across the cracked parking lot toward the motel's second floor. Luke followed, keeping to the shadows, one hand near the gun he'd thankfully thought to grab from his locker before everything went sideways. Echo stopped at room 237, pawing at the door. Luke pressed his ear against the thin wood. From inside came the sound of labored breathing and what might have been whimpering. He drew his gun, then tried the handle. It turned easily, not even locked. The door creaked open to reveal a room that smelled of mold and desperation. In the dim light from a single lamp, he saw a figure huddled in the corner, rocking back and forth. "Police!" "Don't," Luke started, then remembered. "Just don't move." The figure looked up, and Luke felt his world tilt sideways. The man was gaunt, his face covered in scraggly beard, but Luke recognized him from the case files. David Boone, the police informant who had supposedly died 3 years ago. "You're dead," Luke said stupidly. Boone laughed, a horrible, broken sound. "That was the idea. Better dead than what they'd do to me if they found me." His eyes fixed on Echo, who had calmly sat down in the middle of the room. "So, she finally sent you." "She? You mean Sophia Lancaster?" "The cat," Boone wheezed. "It was always about the cat. Sophia's insurance policy. Her way of reaching beyond the grave." He dissolved into a coughing fit. Luke holstered his gun and moved closer. Boone looked like he hadn't eaten properly in days. "You were there the night she disappeared." It wasn't a question, but Boone nodded anyway. "I was her inside source. Had been feeding her information about the trafficking ring for months. Names, dates, shipments. But we didn't know how high it went. Not until..." He trailed off, eyes going distant. "Until what?" "Until we traced it to Commissioner Blackwood. Arby himself. He wasn't just taking bribes to look the other way, he was running the whole operation. Using police resources to protect shipments, using his connections to silence anyone who got close." Boone's hands shook as he pulled a crumpled cigarette from his pocket. "Sophia, she was brilliant. Too brilliant. She didn't just want to expose the trafficking, she found their money trail. Offshore accounts, shell companies, everything linking back to some of the most powerful people in the city." Echo jumped onto the bed, green eyes gleaming in the dim light. Boone stared at the kitten as if seeing a ghost. "That collar," he whispered. "She encoded everything into it. The evidence, the accounts, all of it. Hidden where they'd never think to look. Who'd suspect a cat?" He laughed again, that same broken sound. "But they found out. Someone talked. They came for her at the lighthouse, her special place. I was supposed to meet her there, but I was late. I saw. Luke's phone buzzed. A text from his IT contact. "Money trail found. Blackwood linked to accounts in Cayman Islands. Same accounts showing transfers to multiple department heads, including Harris." "The lighthouse," Luke said. "That's where she hid everything?" Boone nodded. "In plain sight. But the coordinates, they're encoded. Split between..." He stopped suddenly, eyes widening as he looked past Luke to the door. Luke spun around. The doorway was empty, but now he could hear footsteps on the metal walkway outside. Multiple sets, trying to be quiet. "They found me," Boone whispered, terror cracking his voice. "They always find me." Echo suddenly leaped off the bed and pawed at the bathroom door. Luke got the message. He grabbed Boone's arm, hauling him up. "Come on." They barely made it into the bathroom when the room door burst open. Through the crack under the door, Luke saw flashlight beams sweep the room. "Clear!" a voice called. "Wait, check the bathroom." Luke looked around frantically. The bathroom window was small, but they didn't have a choice. He boosted Boone through first, wincing at the thud as the man landed in the bushes below. Echo somehow squeezed through after him. The bathroom door handle started to turn. Luke dove through the window just as gunfire erupted behind him. He rolled on impact, feeling thorns tear at his clothes. Boone was already stumbling toward the parking lot, Echo leading the way. They made it to the car as shouts erupted from above. Luke gunned the engine, tires squealing as they shot out of the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, he saw figures running down the stairs, but they were too late. "The lighthouse," Boone gasped from the back seat, clutching his side. "We have to get to the lighthouse. The evidence, everything she died for." "We will," Luke promised, taking a sharp turn to lose any tail. "But first, we need help." He pulled out his phone one-handed, finding the number he'd gotten from the case file but hadn't dared use until now. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered, cautious but clear. "Hello? Mira Lancaster? My name is Luke Grayson. I need to talk to you about your sister. And about a cat named Shadow." In his lap, Echo purred, and for the first time, Luke swore the sound carried a note of triumph. Mira Lancaster looked eerily like her sister, the same sharp cheekbones and determined eyes, though 5 years of grief had etched deep lines around them. She stood at the window of her small apartment, watching the street below while Luke explained everything. Echo sat on her kitchen counter, methodically washing its paws as if this were just another normal morning. "I knew," Mira said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew she wasn't crazy. The week before she disappeared, Sophia came to me. Said if anything happened, I should watch for Shadow to return. Said the cat would lead the right person to the truth." She turned to face Luke, tears gleaming in her eyes. "I thought grief had broken my mind when I saw this kitten on my doorstep last week. It looked just like Shadow, but younger. Impossible. When it ran away, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. The collar." David Boone spoke up from where he sat slumped at the kitchen table. "The code, it's not complete. Our 375 BLK27 is only half. Shadow, the original Shadow, had the other half." Luke's phone buzzed. Another message from IT. "Police chatter. They're setting up checkpoints. All major roads to the lighthouse covered. Whatever you're planning, do it fast. We need to move," Luke said. "They'll check here eventually." Mira nodded, already grabbing her coat. "I'm coming with you. I need to see this through. For Sophia." They took back roads, Luke's borrowed car struggling up the coastal hills. The lighthouse stood sentinel on its rocky perch, a white finger pointing accusingly at the sky. It had been abandoned for years, the keeper's cottage slowly crumbling into the sea. "There," Boone pointed with a shaking hand. "The maintenance shed. That's where they—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They parked behind a stand of wind-twisted pines. Echo leaped from the car before they could open the doors, heading straight for the shed with purpose. Inside, decades of rust and salt air had turned most of the equipment into tetanus hazards. "The coordinates," Boone muttered, looking at Echo's collar. "Are 375 BLK27. It's not just a case number. R is for row. 375 degrees from magnetic north. B for basement. LK. Lighthouse keeper," Mira finished. "Sophia loved codes. She used to make them up when we were kids." Luke was already counting his steps, compass app open on his phone. The basement access was hidden under a rotting workbench. The hinges screamed as they pulled it open, revealing narrow stairs descending into darkness. Echo went first, tail held high like a banner. Their flashlight beams caught cobwebs and scurrying shapes in the corners. The basement was small, mostly filled with ancient electrical equipment. "Here," Luke said, reaching the spot. 375 degrees from magnetic north puts us, right here." He ran his hands over the wall. There, a loose brick. Behind it was a small cavity containing a waterproof case. Inside were USB drives, a thick manila envelope, and a leather-bound journal. "She did it," Boone breathed. "She actually." The sound of cars on gravel above cut him off. Doors slamming. Footsteps. "Check the cottage first," a familiar voice ordered. Captain Harris. "Then the shed. They're here somewhere." Luke shoved the evidence into his jacket. "Is there another way out?" Mira shook her head, fear etched on her face. Echo, however, was already moving, leading them deeper into the basement. The kitten stopped at what looked like a solid wall, until Luke's flashlight revealed the edges of a bricked-up doorway. "Old smuggler's tunnel," Boone whispered. Runs to the beach. That's how I got away that night. But they sealed it. Luke examined the bricks. The mortar was crumbling, decades of salt air doing their work. Help me, he hissed, starting to pull at the looser ones. They worked frantically, trying to stay quiet as footsteps echoed above. Echoes somehow squeezed through a gap they'd made, mewing encouragement. They'd barely made a hole big enough to crawl through when a voice called down the basement stairs. Well, the gang's all here. They spun to find Harris at the bottom of the stairs, gun drawn. More footsteps behind him, 3 other officers, all with weapons trained on them. 5 years, Harris said, almost conversationally. 5 years we kept this buried. And you had to go digging. He shifted his aim to Boone. You should have stayed dead. It's over, Harris, Luke said, carefully positioning himself in front of Mira. The evidence is already out. My IT contact has copies of everything. Your IT contact? Harris smiled. You mean Officer Chen? Currently being arrested for unauthorized access to police servers? No, Grayson. It's not over. It's just another tragic story of a dirty cop who finished his accomplices before taking his own life. Driven mad by guilt, probably. His finger tightened on the trigger. Several things happened at once. Echo launched itself from the shadows, a tiny orange missile aimed at Harris's face. The captain's shot went wide as he stumbled backward, crashing into his men. Mira grabbed the evidence from Luke's jacket and dove through the hole in the wall. Boone followed, his fragile body somehow finding strength in desperation. Luke had just reached the hole when something slammed into his shoulder, spinning him around. The pain hit a moment later, hot, sharp, overwhelming. He fell through the gap as more shots exploded behind him. The tunnel was pitch black. He could hear Harris shouting, orders to go around to the beach exit. His shoulder was on fire, blood soaking his sleeve. Hands grabbed him, Mira and Boone dragging him forward. Almost there, Mira gasped. The beach exit is just ahead. Echo appeared in front of them, eyes glowing in the darkness like twin emeralds. The kitten seemed to dance between their feet, guiding them forward as they stumbled through the darkness. Behind them, flashlight beams began to penetrate the tunnel. Harris's voice echoed off the stone walls. You can't run forever, Grayson. This only ends one way. But Luke smiled through the pain, because he could see moonlight ahead. Because Mira had the evidence clutched to her chest. Because somewhere above them, a lighthouse stood as witness to buried secrets, finally coming to light. Because Harris was wrong. This was about to end in a way none of them had expected. The morning sun painted the hospital room in shades of gold as Luke scrolled through news headlines on his tablet. Police commissioner arrested in massive trafficking scandal, corruption exposed, dozens of officers indicted, justice for Sophia. Echo lay curled on his lap, purring contentedly. The kitten had refused to leave his side during his 3-day stay, somehow charming even the strictest nurses into allowing it to remain. His shoulder throbbed beneath its bandages. Harris's bullet had gone clean through, missing anything vital by millimeters. They'd barely made it out of the tunnel that night. The beach exit had emerged behind a cluster of rocks, hidden from view. While Harris and his men had rushed to the obvious spots, they'd managed to slip away in the chaos. Mira had contacts in the media, friends of Sophia's who'd been waiting years for this story. By dawn, everything was public. The evidence was overwhelming. Sophia's journal detailed years of investigation, connecting every dot. The USB drives contained financial records, surveillance photos, recorded conversations. She'd built an airtight case, knowing it would likely cost her life. The manila envelope held the final piece, photographs of Commissioner Blackwood personally overseeing a late-night delivery at the docks, taken the night before she died. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mira entered, carrying coffee and looking exhausted but satisfied. Just got out of another meeting with the FBI, she said, handing him a cup. They're calling it the biggest trafficking bust in state history. 37 arrests so far, including Blackwood and Harris. More coming. They found records going back almost a decade. Luke sipped his coffee, wincing at the movement. And Boone? Officially alive again. He's in protective custody, scheduled to testify next month. She sat on the edge of his bed, reaching out to scratch Echo behind the ears. They found Sophia's body. Harris confessed. They're bringing her home. The words hung in the air, heavy with 5 years of grief and waiting. Luke watched as tears slid down Myra's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. The DA wants to talk to you once you're released. They're clearing your name, obviously. The department's offering reinstatement, full rank restoration, even a commendation. Luke stared out the window at the city skyline. The same view he'd looked at for 15 years on the force, but now everything was different. I'm not going back. Myra nodded as if she'd expected this. What will you do? I've been thinking about that. He shifted, pulling a business card from his bedside table. Remember my IT friend? The one they arrested? All charges dropped, of course. He's been helping me set something up. Look. The card was simple, elegant, Grayson Investigations. Finding truth in the shadows. Private investigator? Myra smiled. Sophia would have liked that. Speaking of shadows. Luke looked down at Echo, who met his gaze with that unnervingly intelligent stare. I still don't understand. The timing, the collar, how you led me to everything. Who are you really? The kitten just purred louder. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Myra said softly. Maybe sometimes we just need to be grateful for them. Another knock at the door revealed a nurse with discharge papers. As Luke signed them, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking, international trafficking ring exposed. Arrests made in 5 countries. Sources say evidence came from journalists' files. It's really over. Myra whispered. But Luke knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. In his lap, Echo stood and stretched, then jumped to the windowsill, watching the city below. The morning sun caught the kitten's collar, making the engraved numbers shine like a beacon. R375BLK27. A code that had changed everything. 2 weeks later, Luke sat at his new office desk, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The sign on his door was still fresh, the paint barely dry. Echo lay sprawled across his keyboard, making it impossible to type but somehow looking so pleased with itself that Luke couldn't bring himself to move the cat. The morning's newspaper lay open on his desk, showing a photograph of Sophia Lancaster's memorial service. The turnout had been enormous, journalists, activists, ordinary citizens touched by her story. Her sacrifice had not only exposed a criminal empire but had inspired a wave of anti-trafficking legislation now bearing her name. A tap at his door made him look up. A woman stood there, clutching a photograph of a missing teenager. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was hope in them too. Mr. Grayson? I need help finding my daughter. Someone said you were the one to come to. That you had help from an unusual source. Echo's ears perked up. The kitten rose, stretched, and jumped down to greet the woman, rubbing against her legs in a way that made her smile for perhaps the first time in days. Luke reached for his notebook, thinking of another woman who had refused to let evil go unchallenged, who had reached beyond death itself to ensure justice would be served. He thought of a sister's unwavering faith, a witness who chose truth over safety, and a mysterious kitten who had led him through the darkness to the light. Please, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Tell me everything. Echo jumped back onto the desk, settling between them like a tiny orange guardian. Outside, the city hummed with life, its shadows a little less dark, its secrets a little less buried, thanks to a journalist who had dared to seek the truth and a cat who had carried her final message home. Some said Echo was just a cat who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Others whispered about reincarnation, about spirits and second chances. Luke never claimed to know the truth. But on quiet nights, when the kitten sat in his office window watching the city below, he swore he could see Sophia's determination in those bright green eyes. And in the end, maybe that was enough. Maybe sometimes justice needed more than just human hands to guide it. Maybe sometimes it needed a little magic, a little mystery, and a very special cat with a very special collar. After all, the truth had 9 lives too.